In the past, we've taken a look at several different approaches to playing and capturing pristine video across a number of Nintendo's handheld consoles. But some of the most common questions we get are, what about Sony's handhelds, the PlayStation Portable and the PlayStation Vita? Well, thanks to the ambitions of the homebrew community, a recent development might just be the ultimate solution when it comes to using official hardware for playing PSP, PlayStation Vita, and heck, even PlayStation 1 classics in pixel-perfect clarity on your HD TV. When the PlayStation Portable hit the Japanese market in late 2004, it was seen as the first true competitor in nearly a decade to vie for Nintendo's iron grip on the handheld market. Not to take away from the Neo Geo Pocket Color or anything, but Sony was riding high in the success of the PlayStation 2. If anybody had the mindshare of the public to stand a chance in the portable market, it was the PlayStation name. The PSP's state-of-the-art 480 by 272 screen was impressive, and although it lacked any kind of touch capabilities that the less than a year old Nintendo DS had, the PSP set its sights on a more typical gaming experience. For those looking to play PSP games on a bigger display, Sony added video output to the PSP 2000, a more cost-effective hardware revision released in 2007. Those looking to take advantage could purchase composite, S-Video, and component cables. While all three can be used to display the system menu, PlayStation 1 classics, and video content, composite and S-Video cables cannot display actual PSP games, making them rather useless. Component cables are able to display PSP software, in progressive 480p mode only. Support for 480i output of PSP games is possible with the PSP 3000, which released in 2008, and the PSP Go, released in 2009. In all cases, the native resolution of PSP games is retained within a 720 by 480 window, which for some might feel like a lot of wasted screen space. Most HD TVs tend to handle 480p content decently on their own, but coupling the component output with an upscaler like the XRGB-mini Framemeister, or a line multiplier like the open source scan converter can really make a difference. The PSP was an overall success, despite the imposing shadow of the Nintendo DS's world domination. The portable's much-anticipated follow-up, the PlayStation Vita, arrived in late 2011, once again facing stiff competition from Nintendo's newest handheld, the 3DS. A slew of upgrades over its predecessor, such as an OLED screen, front and rear touch capabilities, and dual analog sticks, make the Vita a truly special piece of hardware. Although it never quite experienced the same level of success as the PSP, a hardcore fanbase has led to a long tail of developer support. The slimmed-down PS Vita 2000 redesign arrived in 2013 that was marginally more portable at the cost of the OLED screen, which was replaced with an IPS LCD. The Vita's built-in screen has a resolution of 960 by 544, which is exactly double that of the PlayStation Portable screen. This allows for a perfect 2x integer scale of PSP games using the system's built-in PSP backwards compatibility, which fills the screen and looks absolutely stunning. Regrettably, neither the 1000 nor the 2000 revision include any sort of video output. Instead, Sony released a separate piece of hardware in 2013 called the Vita TV in Japan, or simply the PlayStation TV as it was called in North America. A rather innocuous-looking device with a small footprint, the PS TV is specifically made to hook up to an HD TV via HDMI, and as such removes all of the hardware needed to make it a standalone portable console. The unfortunate side effect of this is that it lacks some of the more specific hardware needed for certain games. The PS TV supports 3 output resolutions over HDMI for Vita and PSP games: 480p, 720p, and 1080i. On the other hand, downloadable PlayStation 1 classics can only be played in 480p and 720p. Given that the system's entire purpose was to play these games on a larger display, Sony decided that stretching the image to fill the entire screen while applying a generous bilinear filter to mask the disproportionate scaling made the most sense. Built-in display area settings do help to alleviate some of the unevenness, but if an option exists to match the methodology of PSP video output, Simply putting the original resolution inside of the video output frame, it would have been a welcome addition for pixel purists. Here is where a homebrew developer going by the name of Cuvavirus has stepped in to give us this exact thing. The Sharpscale plugin for the PlayStation TV allows the system to display a game's native resolution, as well as provide integer-based upscales. In addition, this plugin can also be used to remove the blemish of forced bilinear filtering and deliver the sharpest image possible. So, could this be the definitive way to capture Vita and PSP games on official hardware? It might just be. But first, there's a couple of things I need to mention before we really get into this. First, this video will not show you how to install the Henkaku custom firmware. That is completely up to you. There's plenty of resources out there for you to check out and walk you through it. Second, the PlayStation TV is unfortunately restricted by HDCP protection. So if you want to capture video from it, you're going to need to find a device or way to work around it. Tri and I got lucky and found an HDMI splitter years ago on eBay that did this, but that listing is long gone by now. Alright, that said, let's go. There's two methods of installing Sharpscale. First, you can manually download the plugin and config program via the thread on the devchroma.nl forums. If you've already done a bit of tinkering with custom firmware, then this should be easy peasy. Although you're going to need to add a line of code to the kernel config document. This isn't nearly as harrowing as it sounds. The other method is via the Auto Plugin 2 app, which, yes, you're going to have to install yourself, but once that's been done, then just select it from the list. After the system reboots, the changes are immediately obvious. Next, let's pop over to the Sharpscale configuration menu app and see what sort of options we have. Scaling mode, PS1 aspect ratio mode, scaling algorithm, and unlock frame buffer size. To the seasoned RGB Masterclass viewer, these seem pretty self-explanatory, but let's see how they apply to the specific types of games that are officially supported on the PSTV, meaning Vita, PSP, PS Minis, and PS1 classics. The scaling modes are naturally the most important piece of the puzzle here. Original matches the typical output of the PSTV, as if you weren't running the plugin at all. Integer performs an integer scale to the largest possible size at your current display resolution. The end result of which is not only based on the resolution that your system is set to, but also the output resolution of the game. Real will show a game at its unscaled resolution, which in some cases can differ between Vita games. It's also important for seeing the true resolution of PSP and PS1 titles. Fitted scales the image to fill the screen while maintaining the correct aspect ratio. It's very comparable to original mode, but is perhaps a bit more accurately scaled. PS1 aspect ratio mode are naturally aimed at the PS1 classics that you can purchase and download from the PlayStation Store. These only apply to those games when you've selected the integer, real, and fitted scaling modes. Well, the option to toggle bilinear filtering was up to the user when playing backwards compatible games on a handheld Vita system. It's forced upon everything on a PSTV. The scaling algorithm option lets you switch between point and bilinear. But this option only comes into play when there's some sort of scaling taking place, such as being integer scaled to a high resolution or filling the screen via fitted mode. In these instances, point gives you sharp pixels, while bilinear is the typical blurring filter that the PSTV normally uses. And lastly, we have unlock frame buffer size. No, don't get too excited. This will not give you 1080p output or anything like that. It has more to do with community projects and how certain games are being patched to run at a higher resolution. So that's a quick overview of the abilities of Sharpscale. I'm sure you're already starting to get an idea how much of a game changer this could be for the PSTV. So let's take a closer look at some of the ins and outs when playing various types of software the PSTV is capable of. Perhaps the defining aspect of the PlayStation Vita is its 960 by 544 screen. While many games on the system don't exactly run at this resolution internally for a variety of reasons, such as frame rate, a majority of them use the system's frame buffer to output video at the screen's native resolution. I say majority because this isn't always the case, and the way each of Sharpscale or scaling modes work is deeply intertwined with the game's output resolution. When you have your PSTV set to 720p, the 960 by 544 game image will be mortised within the 720p frame, much in the same way PSP games were represented using the video out cable on that system. Remember, because most Vita games are shown in their native resolution in this mode, toggling the scaling algorithm won't have any effect in integer and real scaling modes. Now if you set your system to 1080i, then that resolution will be doubled to 1920 by 1088, and the game will completely fill the screen, at the cost of 8 rows of pixels, 4 at the top and 4 on the bottom. Removing the bilinear filtering from a game like Wipeout HD in 1080i really drives home just how impressive the Vita hardware was for its time. So while gorgeous, there's that whole interlaced aspect of 1080i that we have to deal with. Depending on the proficiency of your HDTV's deinterlacer, this might cause additional input lag and inherent deinterlacing artifacts. This might be a deal breaker for some, but I'd be curious to see how it looks running through a high-quality deinterlacer like a DVD-O Edge. Some games output at a lower resolution natively, which can yield some interesting results. One of the system's earliest heavy hitters, Gravity Rush, runs at 720 by 408. At 720p, your game image is going to be even smaller on screen. At 1080i, you have a beautiful 2x scale without any of the image being cut off. But check this out. Hot Shots Golf World Invitational was a launch game in the US that runs at 640 by 360. Running it in the real scaling mode will show you the game's original output resolution, revealing a relatively tiny image. But if you were to double that number, you'd get 1280 by 720, exactly 720p. Set the scaling mode to integer, and it will fill the screen edge to edge during gameplay.
Ooh, that was a good one!
So I suppose with Vita games, things might not be exactly cut and dry with a one-size-fits-all solution, and let's not even get started with the various hacks that can be done to increase a game's internal resolution and more. Those lie outside the scope of this episode, but there are some really cool homebrew utilities out there. Up next, PSP games. One of the most exciting things for me during the early life of the Vita was just how good PlayStation Portable games looked on it. The PSP's native screen resolution is 480 by 272, exactly half of the Vita's. So that perfect 2x scale of content surely swayed some people into buying digital titles that they already owned just so they could see them on that beautiful OLED screen. Of course, that all means nothing when going to an HD TV. Upscaling the original PSP hardware was a mixed bag. The Framemeister's noisier signal was disappointing to me, while line doubling 480p to 960p using an OSSC looks fantastic. Still, one of the most broadly appealing aspects of the PSTV was being able to play PlayStation Portable games on your HD TV with a digital signal. Unlike the PSP's output, which maintains the correct aspect ratio and resolution within a 480p window, a PSTV stretches the Vita's natural 2x scale of PSP content. Combined with the forced bilinear filtering, the base experience is regrettably less than optimal. Granted, I suppose that the main intent was to mask this uneven scaling, but this filter also smooths out the heavy dithering that's common in a lot of PSP games. So this might be a big plus for some. Still, the outright removal of being able to turn it on and off based on preference is pretty disappointing. Sharpscale allows for a variety of situations with PSP games that are pretty neat. Switching the system to 480p with the scaling mode set to integer or real will replicate the PSP's own video output capabilities, without any sort of filtering. It looks incredibly close to the original hardware, don't you think? But of course, the appeal here is to take things even further.
Ready?
720p with integer scaling enabled gives the same perfect 2x scale as the Vita screen, and this is where a PSTV armed with Sharpscale really starts to shine. Like Vita content, PSP is mortised within a 720p frame. Removing the bilinear filter brings an impressive level of clarity. Comparing it to a real PSP paired with an OSSC in 960p, the results are extremely close. But the lack of any sort of analog noise and working within a digital signal from the get-go might give the PSTV a slight edge. Now, let's take it to 1080i for some truly eye-popping results.
Bullets of the Covenant!
1920 by 1088 is a full 4x scale of PSP games, leading to full-screen, ultra-sharp PSP games. As with Vita games, you're once again losing 4 rows of pixels on the top and bottom, and the interlaced video might cause various complications, but wow, right? As I mentioned earlier, an unfortunate side effect is that a large amount of PSP games are heavily dithered. 16-bit color depth was less taxing on the hardware and saved on RAM, to help achieve more consistent frame rates. On the system's built-in screen, this was noticeable, but not too egregious. But when blown up to this size and clarity, well, it might bother you to say the least. One quirk that I don't quite understand yet is the oddball horizontal tear or seam that appears in certain PSP games when played in their original resolution using the real scaling mode. I couldn't replicate it on a real console, so it's entirely possible that this could come down to some weird frame synchronization issue due to backwards compatibility. Regardless of which resolution you choose, the improvements to PSP video quality is well worth the effort to install Sharpscale in and of itself. It's completely revitalized my interest in playing these games on an HD TV.
Ready?
Let's not forget about PlayStation Minis. The oft-forgotten attempt by Sony to capitalize on the booming mobile market also benefit a little bit from Sharpscale. I always felt that these looked really good on a PSP screen, and doing an integer scale on them looks pretty nice. The twist here is that minis are also playable on PlayStation 3 consoles. Although 1080p is an option with that system, the quality looks practically identical to me, with the colors maybe looking slightly richer on a PS3. In some games, such as in the case of Age of Zombies, I noticed dithering in the PSP version that wasn't present on a PS3, so it's entirely possible that these sorts of variables could occur on a game-by-game basis. Which brings us to PS1 classics. Yeah, I realize that there's no shortage of ways to play classic PlayStation games. We went into all sorts of official options back in RGB-206, including the PSTV. But let's quickly recap and see if Sharpscale improves upon the admittedly lackluster base support. When the PSP released in 2005, the idea of backwards compatibility wasn't exactly new, but there was just something really impressive to me that I could play CD-ROM based games on a handheld system. It made revisiting a lot of PlayStation RPGs a real joy. It also helped that the 240p and 480i output resolutions of PS1 games fit easily within the PSP's screen size. They look great. Various adjustments let you scale and stretch the image to your preference, and if using the system's video output, games would display in their native resolution on a CRT. The very same classics could be played on a PlayStation 3 console, although you could choose to use your own physical discs as well. While they are upscaled to HD, the downloadable classics have a slight forced blurring filter applied. However, we found that using actual PlayStation discs would at times circumvent the blurring filter, giving ultra crisp results. It's just too bad this was never a true option for the user. Still, the PS3 remains one of the easiest ways to get good results with PS1 games on high-definition televisions.
This'll teach you.
When PS1 games came to the Vita, the results were similarly impressive. A stunning 2x scale and the option to remove the bilinear filter to your preference marked the most robust option for these classics yet. Needless to say, PS1 games look spectacular on a handheld Vita system. But, of course, the PSTV is, once again, a different story, with Sony hiding away all the options we'd like to mess with and leaving us with disk speed. I guess it's time for Sharpscale to swoop in and once again save the day. First and foremost, PS1 classics only run in 480p and 720p on a PSTV. So 240p will receive a 2x or 3x scale depending on which you have selected, while 480i material will not be scaled at all, since doubling 720 by 480 will be far too big even for 720p. As a result, there will be a discrepancy between the sizing of 240p and 480i screens in scaled and non-scaled modes. At first sight, PS1 games look absolutely amazing on the PSTV. They exceed the visual quality of the downloadable classics on a PlayStation 3 because they're saddled with a blurring filter, so a comparison to disc playback, which lacked the filter, is much more appropriate. A nice trait shared between both platforms is that the forced universal upscale to PS1 games effectively solves the Chrono Cross problem, which has become the shorthand for games that alternate between 240p and 480i resolutions, which usually results in a momentary dropped signal. On real hardware, this can be a real headache in some games, like Silent Hill, where it can be the difference between life and death. The PSTV's original mode retains a proper 4:3 aspect ratio, but it's tough to figure out exactly how evenly they're scaled due to the forced bilinear filter, which masks the shimmer while scrolling. Shrinking the display area to the smallest possible size does look a bit more correct to me, but Sharpscale gives us the tools to get a much sharper image. However, there's some considerations that keep things from being completely cut and dry. Before we get into the interesting stuff, the real scaling mode is fun to check out just to see a game running in its native 240p resolution. And therein lies the challenge with PS1 games. Title screens, to gameplay, to menus, many of the games on the system run at different resolutions, and here is where the PS1 aspect ratio settings come into play. Pixel is based exactly on the resolution a game is displaying, which yields perfect, no shimmer scrolling across the board. Let's take a look at Castlemania Symphony of the Night as an example. As soon as you boot up the game, you'll notice that something is off. The title screen is stretched, because this screen in particular is 512 pixels wide. If you're playing it on original hardware on a CRT, then the 4:3 aspect of a CRT television would squish the image to look correct. But here, when those pixels are mapped to a 720p canvas, the 512 pixel wide image will look stretched. The file select screen is a different resolution as well. And then, since many of the assets for Symphony of the Night were pulled directly from Rondo of Blood on the PC Engine CD, it made the most sense to build the gameplay around the 256 pixel wide aspect of that game. So you start to see how things can be all over the place. And this is a relatively minor example. You never know when you might run into an odd resolution that just looks terrible.
That's disgusting.
So this is the reason for the existence of the 4:3 and 16:9 PS1 aspect ratio modes. Selecting one will force all screen modes to the chosen size. The upside being that things look more correct from screen to screen, but the downside is that you'll likely have uneven pixels on the horizontal axis, and thus shimmer when the screen scrolls. Before you let this bother you, I'd like to note that this issue is most visible in 2D side-scrolling games. In 3D games, where most of the action moves along the Z-axis, the uneven sizing is much less apparent. Although there's no true 100% winning aspect mode for PS1 games, Pixel Mode is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of Sharpscale, because it lays bare the true resolution used for various screens in PS1 games. Even though it's still fairly early in development, there's plenty left to explore with Sharpscale. Cubavirus has mentioned potential updates that might enable 1080p 30 and native 544p 60 output, which would further bolster its overall usefulness, not to mention how it might enhance the various community projects that are currently in the works. If you ask me, Sharpscale is a true game changer for the PlayStation TV. It's turned what is generally considered a disappointing device into something that is among the best, if not the best official option for playing Vita, PSP, and PS1 classics on an HD TV. I can't stress how happy I am that this plugin exists, and I want to send out a big thanks to Cubavirus and everyone who helped make it happen.